August 4, 1944. The Alabama sun beat down upon the sprawling prisoner of war camp at Aliceville, its heat rippling over the dusty yards and shimmering against the coils of barbed wire that crowned the fences. The cicadas sang their endless chorus from the trees beyond the perimeter, a kind of indifferent music that carried over the murmurs of the prisoners assembled for roll call. They were not the ragged, half-starved men who had stumbled into Allied custody on battlefields across Europe. These were women, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, and camp followers of the German forces, shipped across the Atlantic into the heart of America. Some still wore the faint traces of the uniforms they had served in, though their insignias had long been stripped away. To them, the camp was both prison and strange sanctuary. They were enemies, yet treated with a civility that unsettled as much as it reassured. This morning's ritual, however, promised amusement. As the women lined in formation, their eyes fell upon one of the guards posted at the edge of the yard. He did not look like the soldier they had imagined when they first heard tales of the American army. Barely 5'4", with a lean frame that seemed lost in the khaki of his uniform, Private First Class James O'Donnell cut an almost comical figure beside the taller MPs. His steel helmet sat awkwardly low as if trying to swallow him whole, and his M1 rifle, slung over his shoulder, appeared nearly as tall as its bearer. The sight broke the stiffness of the German line, and soon whispers darted from one woman to another like sparks racing along dry grass. "Er ist kleiner als wir," one said, her lips curling into a smirk. "He is smaller than us." The remark passed down the row, gathering laughter. Some pointed, others elbowed their companions, delighting in the irony that America, the mighty nation they had been warned of, with its endless factories and vast armies, would station such a boyish figure to guard them. One nurse, broad-shouldered and tall, folded her arms across her chest and whispered that she could carry him off under one arm like a sack of flour. Another, shaking her head, quipped that the Americans must be scraping the bottom of the barrel, sending children to play soldier while real men fought overseas. The laughter grew bolder, spilling into outright giggles that echoed off the barracks walls. O'Donnell heard every word. He could not have missed it, though he did not understand the German tongue. Yet he did not need translation. The tones of mockery were universal. His eyes, a pale blue under the brim of his helmet, flicked toward the row of women only once. His expression gave nothing away, neither shame nor anger, before returning to its steady survey of the yard. He shifted his rifle against his shoulder with the same unhurried precision of any other soldier on duty. It was this composure, more than his size, that unsettled some of the prisoners even as they laughed. The small ones, they thought, were supposed to blush, to shrink under the weight of ridicule. Yet O'Donnell stood like a stone marker, unmoved, uninterested, a figure carved into the routine of camp life. His silence left a vacuum that the women filled with more whispers, more jokes, each louder than the last as though testing the limits of his patience. Still nothing. Beyond the wire, the camp hummed with its usual rhythm. Trucks rattled along dirt roads, delivering crates of supplies. In the mess hall, cooks prepared vats of food that would later surprise the German captives with its abundance. A record player somewhere in the guards' quarters sent faint strains of swing music floating into the air. To the POWs, these sounds were alien reminders of a world untouched by rubble and shortages, a world that seemed almost indecently at ease while Europe bled. And against this backdrop, the figure of the little guard became a symbol, an easy target for scorn, a contradiction to their ingrained images of American strength. Yet even as they mocked, there was a strange undertone, a flicker of curiosity behind the derision. Who was this man really? His youth was obvious, but his eyes, when they lifted, carried something older, a weariness not explained by a few months of training or the tedium of camp duty. His uniform bore no special insignia beyond the stripes of a private first class, no medals to betray a past. To the prisoners, he seemed merely a curiosity, a harmless oddity in a place already full of contradictions. That evening, when the prisoners were escorted back into their barracks and the Alabama sun gave way to the heavy curtain of twilight, the laughter lingered. Some women replayed their jokes, exaggerating them for the amusement of their companions. They imitated the way his helmet tipped forward, the way the rifle nearly dwarfed him. Others speculated that he was the son of some officer, placed here because he was too fragile for real combat. Their derision carried the brittle edge of pride, a way to preserve dignity while living behind barbed wire. If the Americans could be ridiculed, perhaps their own capture felt less humiliating. O'Donnell, meanwhile, returned to his quarters and removed his helmet, setting it down with practiced care. His hair, cropped short, was damp with sweat. He sat on his cot, unstrapped his boots, and reached for a battered canteen. The other guards joked and bantered among themselves, trading stories from home or rumors from the front lines. He joined in occasionally with a faint smile, but mostly he listened, silent, as though the weight of other memories pressed against his mind. He never mentioned the mockery he endured that morning. He had heard worse in languages he understood. For now, the German women thought they had uncovered a weakness in their captors. They believed size told the whole story, that appearances revealed all. They believed the small guard was nothing but a figure of ridicule, a symbol of how America overreached, sending children to play at war. Their laughter gave them a fleeting sense of power in a world where they otherwise had none. But the truth was far different, buried within the guard's own history, written in battles fought under skies half a world away. The camp settled into darkness, the cicadas now joined by the hum of night insects, and the women lay on their bunks replaying the day's entertainment. They did not know, could not yet know, that the man they laughed at had once held a line under withering fire, that his size had meant nothing in the deserts of North Africa, that his record told of courage measured not in inches but in deeds. For now they only saw the helmet that slipped too low and the rifle too long. They laughed at a shadow. But history has a way of revealing what laughter tries to hide. And what these women would soon learn about the little guard would silence their jokes forever. By the summer of 1944, the United States had become the reluctant custodian of an astonishing number of enemy prisoners. More than 400,000 Axis soldiers and auxiliaries were scattered across the country, guarded in camps that stretched from Texas plains to the wooded hills of Pennsylvania. The American people, though at war, were determined to uphold the Geneva Convention, believing that the measure of a democracy lay not only in how it fought its battles but also in how it treated its captives. Aliceville, Alabama, was one such camp, and within its fences life unfolded in ways that blurred the stark line between conqueror and conquered. For the German women confined there, the experience was surreal. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty, even vengeance, from the enemy they had been told was decadent and weak. Instead, they found food served with regularity, medical care offered without question, and barracks built sturdier than many of the homes left behind in bombed-out Europe. Still, captivity was captivity. The humiliation of surrender did not vanish with the taste of white bread or the warmth of a cotton blanket. Pride clung to them as fiercely as the uniforms they no longer wore, and each prisoner sought some foothold of dignity in the daily routines of camp life. It was here that the figure of Private First Class James O'Donnell became a point of fixation. He was not like the towering guards who strutted along the wire, their shadows long against the dust, rifles carried with an ease that matched their confident strides. O'Donnell's small stature seemed almost to mock the role he played. His helmet dipped low, his boots seemed a size too large, and when he walked the perimeter, some prisoners whispered he looked like a boy trudging to school. To the women, so many of them taller, broader, and older than he, his presence became a mirror in which their own frustrations could be reflected and ridiculed. They had lost their place in the war, but here was someone they could laugh at without consequence. Yet O'Donnell was no accidental symbol. His assignment to Aliceville was not the mark of inexperience or weakness but the result of a transfer that came only after months of service in theaters far from the Alabama woods. His fellow guards knew pieces of his story, though he never volunteered it himself. They had read the notes in his file, heard fragments passed in low voices. A machine gun nest man beyond endurance at Kasserine Pass, the bloodied sands of Tunisia, the silence of a hospital ward where he had once lain recovering from shrapnel wounds. These details were not for boasting. O'Donnell spoke little of the war except when asked directly, and even then his answers were clipped, almost reluctant, as though words might cheapen what memory had carved into him. To the women prisoners, however, these facts were hidden, and so their impressions were shaped only by appearances. Each roll call became a theater where their amusement played out. A tilt of his helmet inspired a whisper. A shift of his rifle earned a smirk. Their laughter was not without layers. Beneath the surface mockery lay denial, a refusal to accept that they were powerless in this land so far from home. To see a small man in uniform was to believe that they had not been bested by strength but by accident, by a fluke of fortune. If America's defenders were children, then perhaps Germany had not truly lost. The irony deepened when compared to the reality of American abundance. Outside the barbed wire, fields yielded cotton and corn in quantities unimaginable to Europeans scraping by on rations. Supply convoys rolled steadily, their tires grinding over gravel, their contents filling warehouses with canned meat, flour, and coffee. Newspapers circulated in the camp library, some in English, some translated for the prisoners, displaying photographs of American families smiling beside cars, refrigerators, and radios. The women absorbed these images with a mixture of envy and disbelief. They had come from cities where bread was scarce, where children wore patched clothes, where the drone of Allied bombers was more familiar than the ring of a church bell. Here, in the very heart of their enemy's homeland, plenty seemed to mock scarcity at every turn. O'Donnell walked among these contradictions with a quiet bearing that neither flaunted victory nor indulged in cruelty. His silence, in fact, only sharpened the divide between perception and truth. When the women taunted him, he did not flinch. When they whispered among themselves, he did not react. If he heard, he gave no sign. To some guards, this restraint was admirable. To others, it was puzzling, a missed opportunity to assert authority. But O'Donnell had no need to assert what he had already proven long before. His war had been fought in heat and dust, in places whose names were carved into memory with fire. Kasserine, Sidi Bou Zid al-Guettar. The barbs of laughter from behind a fence could not pierce deeper than the memory of bullets whistling across a battlefield. The women, however, mistook his composure for weakness. It emboldened them, encouraged more jokes, more laughter. They nudged one another as he passed, making comments under their breath, sometimes in English just to be sure he heard. "Too small for a man," one said, drawing giggles from her companions. The mockery became part of their daily ritual, a subtle rebellion against the monotony of camp life. And yet, beneath the surface, curiosity simmered. Why did he not respond? Why did his eyes carry that distant weight? Why did the other guards, larger and more imposing, sometimes look at him with a respect out of proportion to his rank? The central conflict between perception and truth grew sharper each day. The prisoners believed they saw the whole man in a single glance. The guards knew they saw only the surface. O'Donnell himself revealed nothing, and in that silence lay the seed of revelation. Every laugh, every whisper, every smirk brought the women closer to a reckoning they did not expect. For while the fences held them captive, it would be knowledge that truly disarmed their pride. One afternoon, a German interpreter attached to the camp happened to overhear a conversation between American officers discussing personnel files. Names were mentioned, assignments recounted, battles listed with the precision of military records. Among them was the name O'Donnell. The interpreter, curious, made note. That evening in the barracks, she repeated what she had heard. At first, the women laughed again, dismissing the notion. But the details grew more specific. Tunisia, a machine gun position held when others had fallen back, a silver star awarded for valor. The laughter faltered. Eyebrows lifted. Silence crept into the room where moments earlier there had been only mockery. The truth had begun to surface, though not yet in full. Whispers now traveled with a different tone, less certain, tinged with doubt. Could it be true? Could the little guard they had ridiculed so freely be the same man whose courage was spoken of with reverence by his own officers? Their minds wrestled with the contradiction, caught between pride and dawning realization. That night, as O'Donnell resumed his post by the perimeter fence, the laughter was gone. The women still watched him, but their glances lingered longer, their expressions more complex. Amusement gave way to unease, unease to reluctant curiosity. They had mocked a figure they thought was beneath them. Now they sensed there was more, and that more would change everything. The story had shifted, though they did not yet know how far it would go. The man they had thought a child was about to become something else entirely in their eyes, and the knowledge would spread like fire through the camp. What began as a joke was about to turn into a lesson, one that history has repeated again and again. Appearances deceive, but records endure. The revelation did not come all at once. At first it was only a rumor, a whisper traded across bunks in the dim glow of the barracks. Some dismissed it as an invention of the guards, a piece of propaganda meant to cow them into silence. Others laughed it off, clinging to the image of the awkward little soldier they had mocked at roll call. But rumors have a way of finding roots in uncertain soil, and by the third day the whisper had grown legs. The name O'Donnell, once the butt of their jokes, now carried a faint edge of intrigue. The turning point came during a rare delivery of Red Cross parcels. As women lined up to receive their allotted tins of milk, packets of coffee, and bars of soap, 2 American officers walked past, their voices carrying just far enough. One read aloud from a clipboard, cataloging guard assignments. O'Donnell James. North Perimeter Rotation. Silver Star, Tunisia. Twice wounded. The other officer, barely lifting his head, muttered, "Tough kid. Never says much, but everyone in the unit knew him." Their words were not meant for the prisoner's ears, but they drifted across the yard nonetheless. The interpreter among the women caught every syllable, translating with exactness later that night. The laughter that followed was uneasy, thinner than before. "Medals can be given to anyone," one nurse insisted, though the shake in her voice betrayed her doubt. "Americans love theatrics." Another countered that silver stars were not handed out like cigarettes. The debate stretched late into the night, circling the same questions. Could this quiet, unimposing figure truly have stood amid the roar of German artillery? Could the boy who seemed to disappear beneath his helmet have been forged in fire the likes of which even they had never seen? Over the following days, more fragments of truth surfaced. A sergeant casually remarked in the mess hall that O'Donnell had dragged a wounded comrade to safety while shells burst around them. Another mentioned that he had once manned a machine gun for hours without relief, refusing to abandon his position even when others had fallen back. Each detail painted a new portrait, slowly erasing the caricature of weakness the women had created. Their jokes began to ring hollow, their barbs turning into silence. They watched him differently now, measuring him not by his size but by the weight of what they did not yet fully know. The change unsettled them. 4 weeks O'Donnell had been their small rebellion, their shared amusement in the monotony of captivity. To lose that was to lose a kind of power. But the human mind does not easily dismiss courage when confronted with it. One woman, taller than the guard by nearly a head, recalled her brother's letters from North Africa, describing the chaos of sandstorms and sudden German counterattacks. She realized with a pang of reluctant respect that this very man might have been there, facing the same fire that had nearly killed her own kin. The irony bit deep. O'Donnell himself offered no confirmation. His silence, always steady, became almost impenetrable. If he heard the whispers, he gave no sign. When a German woman approached him one morning during work detail, feigning clumsy English to ask if he had seen Africa, he only tilted his head and replied softly, "I've seen enough." The brevity of his answer silenced her more effectively than a lecture ever could. She carried those words back to the barracks, where they became another seed of speculation. The tension in the camp shifted subtly. The mockery that once filled the yard during roll call was replaced by a cautious quiet. Eyes still turned toward the small guard, but now the glances lingered, colored with uncertainty. Some women avoided meeting his gaze altogether. Others studied him with a curiosity tinged by respect they did not wish to admit. The man they had once ridiculed had become a question they could not answer, and questions, unlike jokes, gnawed at the mind. To understand the depth of their change, one must recall the context of that summer. The German army, once thought invincible, was in retreat on every front. News filtered through the camp: D-Day landings in Normandy, the Allied push across France, Soviet advances in the east. For these prisoners, pride was the last shield against despair. By mocking O'Donnell, they had told themselves Germany still stood tall. By learning of his record, they were forced to admit that appearances lied, that even a man smaller than them might carry victories that dwarfed their own sacrifices. Statistics lent weight to the revelation. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces had suffered over 6,000 casualties in a bitter baptism of fire. Units crumbled under the seasoned assault of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Yet within that chaos, pockets of resistance held, and men like O'Donnell were forged. Accounts spoke of his platoon pinned down by machine gun fire, ammunition running low, morale faltering. O'Donnell, just 20 years old, had carried belts of ammunition across open ground, bullets snapping inches from his body. Later, he manned the gun himself, holding until reinforcements arrived. That deed alone had earned him a Silver Star. His wounds came later, shrapnel tearing into his side during another skirmish. He recovered, returned to his unit, and fought on until rotation brought him home. To the women hearing these details secondhand, the story seemed almost impossible. They had laughed at his short stride, but that stride had once carried him across a killing field. They had mocked his size, but his frame had endured the weight of battle few of them could imagine. Irony cut deep, and with it came the sting of shame. The camp's atmosphere reflected this shift. When O'Donnell passed during inspection, silence followed him instead of laughter. One afternoon, a tall prisoner who had once mocked him most loudly offered a stiff, almost reluctant salute. He did not return it, only nodded, but the gesture rippled through the group like a confession. From then on, the tone of their conversations changed. Jokes gave way to guarded respect and in some voices, admiration. Humor still surfaced but differently. A few whispered ironically that America's smallest guard had proven the largest in courage. One nurse, trying to break the tension, quipped, "Perhaps we should all be so small if that is what it takes." The laughter that followed was nervous, acknowledging a truth they could not escape. O'Donnell remained the same, his routine unchanged, his silence intact. But his presence had grown. He was no longer a figure of ridicule but of contradiction. A reminder that judgment built on appearances collapses under the weight of reality. The women, once so certain, now found themselves measuring their own assumptions, their own pride. It was not an easy transformation, but it was undeniable. By late August, the story of the little guard had spread through every barracks. Each prisoner had heard it, each had wrestled with it. And though some clung to denial, most could not help but feel the shift in their own hearts. They had seen a man they thought beneath them rise above them in the only measure that mattered: courage in the crucible of war. As the sun set one evening, casting long shadows across the camp, O'Donnell stood once more at the perimeter. The barbed wire glowed orange in the fading light, and the cicadas sang their endless song. Behind the fence, women watched him in silence, the laughter gone, replaced by something far heavier. They had mocked a boy, but they now saw a soldier. And though none spoke it aloud, they understood that the lesson was theirs to carry. Appearances deceive, but records, like scars, do not lie. The silence that followed the revelation of O'Donnell's past did not fade. It deepened. Days turned into weeks, and with each roll call, the transformation of the German prisoners became more apparent. Where once there had been laughter and whispers, there was now restraint, a tension that clung to the air like humidity. The women stood straighter when he passed, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a dawning awareness that they had misjudged him entirely. They had mocked a child, only to discover they had stood in the presence of a seasoned soldier whose courage had already been proven in ways they could scarcely imagine. The central conflict had shifted from their ridicule to their own pride, their own shame, and the slow realization that their assumptions had blinded them. O'Donnell did not change his demeanor. He still performed his duties with the same quiet efficiency, still walked the perimeter with his rifle slung over his shoulder, still wore the helmet that shaded his eyes. If anything, his indifference reinforced the respect growing among the prisoners. He had not sought their acknowledgement, had not boasted of his past, had not even defended himself against their laughter. His silence carried more weight than any speech. That silence forced them to reckon with what they had learned, to confront the uncomfortable truth that valor does not always wear the form they expect. Among the prisoners, the shift became personal. One nurse who had laughed the loudest now found herself watching O'Donnell's movements with a kind of reverence. She remembered her fiancé, killed on the Eastern Front, and realized that this small guard had endured dangers no less severe. Another woman, once scornful, began to greet him in the morning with a quiet nod. Though her English was broken, the sincerity of her gesture required no translation. Even those who resisted the change felt the undercurrent, an erosion of their certainty that mocked appearances could shield them from despair. It was during one of those heavy afternoons, the Alabama sky thick with storm clouds, that the change revealed itself most vividly. The women were assembled for work detail, hauling supplies and tending to gardens within the compound. A thunderclap cracked above them, startling several into laughter, nervous and fleeting. But when O'Donnell appeared to supervise, the laughter quieted at once. His presence, once a source of amusement, now carried a gravity that demanded silence. He said little, offering only the occasional instruction, his voice calm, steady, and measured. Yet even the most defiant among them obeyed without question. It was not authority in the uniform that compelled them, it was the authority of respect reluctantly earned. One evening the tension reached its climax. The prisoners gathered in the yard for evening count, storm clouds rolling across the horizon, lightning splitting the distance. The guards lined the perimeter, their shadows long against the ground. O'Donnell stood at his post, his figure small against the barbed wire fence. For a moment, a gust of wind lifted dust into the air, obscuring the yard. When it cleared, the women stared at him in silence. Something passed between them all in that instant, unspoken yet undeniable. He was no longer the boy they had mocked. He was the soldier who had endured fire and returned alive, the man who carried scars invisible but real, the quiet presence who asked nothing yet commanded everything. The climax came when one of the tallest prisoners, a woman known for her sharp tongue and mocking laugh, stepped forward after roll call. The guards stiffened, hands tightening on their rifles, but she did not move with aggression. Instead, she raised her hand slowly in salute. It was a gesture foreign to the camp, almost forbidden for prisoners to honor their captors. Yet she held it firm, her eyes locked on O'Donnell. The yard fell silent. Every prisoner watched, every guard waited. O'Donnell did not flinch, did not look away. After a long pause, he nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, nothing more. And yet that single nod carried the weight of an entire war. The effect was immediate and profound. Other women followed her lead, not all at once but gradually in gestures smaller than salutes. A respectful silence, a lowered gaze, a faint murmur of greeting. The ridicule was gone. In its place grew a recognition they could not suppress, even if pride told them otherwise. They had been defeated not only in battle but in judgment, in their own arrogance. The little guard had taught them a lesson no lecture could deliver, that courage does not conform to stature, that dignity survives not in appearances but in deeds. O'Donnell himself never spoke of the change. To him, respect was unnecessary, laughter irrelevant. He did not guard prisoners for acknowledgement, nor did he measure himself by their opinions. But he felt the difference in the air, the absence of ridicule, the quiet that followed his steps. Perhaps he understood what had changed, perhaps not. If he did, he carried it with the same silence as he carried his past. The camp returned to its rhythm. Trucks rolled in, meals were served, the Alabama sun blazed overhead, but something permanent had shifted. The German women no longer mocked him, and in their restraint lay the memory of their own humiliation. They had learned, in a way harsher than any punishment, that appearances deceive and that truth emerges from deeds. For O'Donnell, nothing needed to be proven. For the women, everything had been revealed. As the war dragged on, news of Germany's defeats continued to filter through the camp. With each headline, the prisoners felt the walls of their pride crumble further. Yet the lesson of the little guard lingered strongest. When they thought of their own soldiers, many tall, proud, and uniformed, they remembered that the small American had stood larger than them all in the only measure that mattered. He had endured, he had fought, and he had survived. The story of that summer closed not with a grand declaration but with a quiet image. O'Donnell, standing alone at dusk by the fence, the orange glow of sunset behind him, his small figure framed against the vast Alabama sky. The cicadas droned, the prisoners moved about their barracks, and the camp seemed unchanged. Yet in the minds of those who watched him, something enduring had been carved. He was no longer the little guard. He was a soldier, and in their eyes, a man to be respected. History often records battles, strategies, and nations in collapse. But sometimes it is in the smallest figures, in the overlooked and underestimated, that the truest lessons are found. In Aliceville, Alabama, in the heat of 1944, German prisoners of war learned that lesson through the quiet bearing of a man they once mocked. They discovered that courage is not measured in inches or pounds, but in the choices one makes when the world is burning. And they carried that realization long after the gates of the camp opened and their captivity ended. For the viewer of this story, the image remains vivid. A boyish guard, ridiculed for his size, revealed as a hero by his deeds. In that revelation lies the irony of war, the folly of judgment, and the timeless truth that the greatest strength often hides in the most unassuming forms. If this story surprised you, let it serve as a reminder of the countless hidden histories waiting to be told. And if you found value in it, consider leaving a like, subscribing to this channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. After all, history is not just about nations. It is about the quiet figures who, in silence, prove themselves giants.